Once it's okay, we're live. Hello, Professor Shore. How are you today?
I'm well. It's a beautiful year. I'm happy to see one of my former students.
Yeah, I know I took your class during COVID, so we never got to meet face to face, but it was one of the classes that I enjoyed the most. The sections, I mean, they all worked out pretty well because it was small group discussions. And the topic was very interesting to me. For context, I was a history major. I focused on the history of social change and social movements, and of course, the ideas of intellectuals intersected with that over and over because often social change and social movements start with the ideas of someone who's just thinking intensely about society and the issues within society and how they can fix it. And that obviously seems to be your specialty and expertise. So I'm really excited to dive into our conversation. For anyone who's joining, y'all probably saw the headline of the article that I wrote a few weeks ago. I believe it was titled "My Yale Professor Fled America to Escape Trump," which is pretty like I don't know, it's pretty like maybe like Mission Impossible, like spy thriller, like trying to get out, Cold War-esque. But also pretty accurate. I mean, it pretty accurately describes what happened, and what you did in your reaction as you saw the signs of Trumpism and what it could do to our country. So I'm just gonna start with you explaining perhaps that decision. You can start with a quick introduction of who you are, but feel free to lead it into the decision you made to leave the United States recently.
Okay, well, first of all, I should say it was a much more gradual decision and probably much less dramatic than
Yeah, yeah.
yours. I'm a professor of European intellectual history. Is focused on Eastern Europe, which is somewhat atypical for my field. I work a lot on, more obscure languages, Czech, English. I work a lot between Germany. I've been working a lot on Ukraine in the past 10 years. I've been teaching at 2006. I've loved teaching at Yale. So, but the first say is that it's really that well for professors to make mid-career moves. Going from one good university to another good university is not actually so radical. It's true. It was a long and processed decision. There were a lot of reasons why I'd been panicked for at least the last 10 years. Um, One, I could say I'm a neurotic catastrophist. I'm a very angry person by nature. You know, events could be subtitled "Vindication of the Neurotic Catastrophist"
Mhm.
for dark fantasies. Um, but I should say first, when Trump first came on the scene in late 2015, well, actually, we can go back. I started panicking when Sarah Palin came on the scene. Um,
Mhm.
Sarah Palin and John McCain. To me, that was against Obama. This was now before your time, before, but that election also incredibly decisive, not only, for all of the reasons that Obama's candidacy was remarkable. I mean, I did not think that I would live in my lifetime to see it, and that was an extraordinary thing to watch. And he was an extraordinary figure in many ways. We could talk about him if you want. And John McCain was a known figure. I mean, he comes from what historians might call the old right, a kind of old conservative right. And he selected Sarah Palin, she to me was a character right out of the 1930s.
Mhm.
Yep. Thought, Romania, the relationship between Antonescu and the Iron Guard, Hungary, the relationship between General Horthy and the Arrow Cross. That was a time in the 1930s where you have these fascist movements rising. And it takes the old right, the old conservative right, some time to realize that the new fascist right is not just a younger, more energetic version of themselves. And to use an imperfect analogy, and all analogies are imperfect, if you can think about the old right as, the traditional conservatives who go to their golf clubs, which probably haven't admitted blacks and Jews, have brunch every Sunday and have fancy dinner parties, and have certain traditional ideas about who should be the elite of society. Okay, that's one thing. Um, that was never going to be the side of politics I was on, but it's one phenomenon. And then you have like the Ku Klux Klan, let's go out and lynch people, orgy of violence, orgiastic cleansing. Um, and that was, that's an imperfect analogy, but if you think about like the guys at the golf club who would never think about getting their hands dirty or actually committing violence, but clearly have, racist inclinations and, you know, prefer to preserve a certain hierarchy, and then they suddenly end up with the Ku Klux Klan types who are suddenly, riding around lynching people and burning things. That was the 1930s. That was these alliances that the old right doesn't realize things are spiraling out of control. They don't realize the violence they've unleashed. And that to me was John McCain and Sarah Palin. I
Mm,
vote for McCain. I've always been a person on the left, but he was not, a lunatic. He did lots of things I may have disagreed with, but he was not someone for whom, like his supporters and I, would not have been able to have a conversation. Sarah Palin comes on the scene, and I thought she lives in a totally fictitious world, in which anything is possible. She recognizes no sense of restraint, and she will happily incite a mob to lynch someone. And
mm,
was unleashed at that moment. And then when Obama won, I had this feeling that McCain was actually relieved. When he gave that concession speech, I thought that he himself got started to be afraid, of what had been unleashed, which I might have recognized because Antonescu and interwar Romania started to get afraid of what had been unleashed. I think he was relieved, and then Obama came in and it seemed like there was hope. Like this was going to be a new era, and that homegrown fascist temptation, that genie out of the bottle, I felt like it had been somehow pushed back in the bottle. And then it comes back again, right? It comes
mm,
2015. And then in this post-truth form, where you have a total unhinging from empirical reality. And if I panicked sooner than most of my American colleagues in 2015, it's not because I was smarter, but because I was watching what was happening in Russia and Ukraine. And it gave
mm.
me a head start. It gave me a head start on certain ways in which you could detach a society from empirical reality. I mean, truth is a constraint, right? Truth is a limit. It sets certain limits to things. So when you don't recognize truth, that really opens up this space for anything to be possible. So I started panicking early. This is a long detour in your question. I started panicking early in 2015. My impulse the day after the November 2016 elections was to get out. Very like I I didn't think Trump was going to win. I was worried about I was not confident he wouldn't win. I was very, very nervous, but I didn't think it was actually going to happen. And when it did, I was just paralyzed. I mean, the moment when I had to wake up and tell my little kids, who were 4 and 6 at the time, that the bad guy won was just one of the most wrenching parenting moments I've ever had. Because they were too young, obviously, to understand exactly what had happened. But they were old enough to know that something had happened that just devastated all the adults around them. You know, kids can feel that, right? Like kind of suck up
Yeah.
the. And I remember taking them to vote with me at Wilbur Cross High School, and Caleb, who was 6, saying to me, "Mommy, if Hillary Clinton wins, all the grown-ups are going to calm down, right? Yeah, we're all going to calm down." And then it wasn't okay. Um, and so, yeah, my impulse, like as a neurotic Jew, I thought, okay, lesson of 33, you get out sooner rather than later. And my husband and I debated it a lot at the time, in the aftermath of those elections. And we ended up feeling a kind of moral obligation to stay and teach and try to mobilize the opposition. Um, and that sense of, was it good for the kids that we stayed? Their whole childhood has been colored by this rising fascism, by the sense of despair, by really the sense of evil in the world, by the sense of watching of it, and of being implicated in that evil, because we're all implicated. That's what it means to live in these, like certainly to live in a totalitarian society, but to live in a society means that you're implicated in the evil of that society. Trump is taking children away from their parents on the US Mexican border and throwing them in cages. And I thought, I am also guilty of that. Um, I'm also implicated. I'm part of this society that has allowed this to happen. Uh, So that the vacillation about staying or going had been brewing for a really, really long time. Um, I was definitely feeling very kind of worn out and unsure I was doing the best thing for my kids. The monk school at University of Toronto had been recruiting me and my husband for a few years. It's an especially attractive place. Um, one, I should say that I did my MA at University of Toronto in the 90s, so I had
Mhm.
nostalgia about it. It was a fantastically good MA year for me. It was intellectually incredibly productive year, and I loved the city. And so there was that, but there was the monk school was founded by this remarkable woman who is a force of nature, Janice Stein, who is a political scientist, and specifically as an interdisciplinary institute within a university that would cultivate academic scholarship that was simultaneously public facing.
Hmm.
And that was very important to me, and it's become more important to me over the years, this public facing element. And I'm sure, I mean, now your whole life is public facing, but I'm sure
Absolutely.
there's there's a lot of tension at the university between about for whom should we be writing? And that's a constant question. It's a constant question about audience and do we want to water down, our research and package it for public consumption? And should intellectuals be engaging in politics at all? So there's the question of voice. Do you want to make things accessible? And then there's the question of political engagement. Should you be polemically, or normatively, intervening?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to that point specifically, I have been reached out to by a number of my professors at Yale, who are looking into being more public facing, specifically on social media, is when they would come to me. And it seems that a dire situation is calling for people to really branch out of their comfort zones. When it specifically comes to like people in academia, that means creating TikToks for the first time. So, for example, there's Professor Ned Blackhawk. A few years ago, we made a TikTok together to promote his book, which won a book award, by the way. Everyone definitely go check it out. The Rediscovery of America, and that was made in ahead of July 4th. He's just talking about how the one way that we interpret the independence movement and the Declaration of Independence is through the ideals that were taught in school that the United States was just sick of the tyranny of the British. And we don't learn that a lot of colonists and people over here in the States were actually mad that the British had a better relationship with Native Americans and sought to, in some ways, protect them with certain proclamations. And they wanted none of that. The frontiersmen wanted to expand the frontier. So yeah, I mean, I could only see more professors becoming more public facing. I think that's a great thing. Um, I know there's long been debates about that, but from my point of view, and it seems like from what you're doing now, you also see the value in that, especially in these times.
I think I think the force of the weight of historical catastrophes has made me feel like there's not really a moral space to stand aside.
Mhm.
Now, I may feel that more because I come to this not as I'm American, but I'm not an Americanist, right? Like I was
Mhm.
in American history and American politics. I was trained in Eastern Europe. I was trained as a Slavicist. And so much of what you do in that role of being a historian of a part of the world that is not your own part of the world, is trying to make it comprehensible for people in your part of the world. So there's already a certain exercise in translation or cultural mediation, in that I'm trying to write in such a way, this is what historians do in general, that readers can make an imaginative leap into a time and a place where they themselves were not. Most of my sources for my books have generally not been in English. I'm translating those sources, those voices. I'm trying to structure narratives in such a way that, non East Europeans can understand them. So that's already, it's already a certain kind of translation. It's already a step closer in that sense to
Yeah.
public because
Think
you have to describe things that are foreign in a way that's going to be understandable for an audience that's your own.
yeah.
And in that mode, and while I had normally been writing about people who were dead, that's what historians do most of the um, definitely since the Ukrainian Revolution in 2013, 2014, in which so many of my friends and colleagues involved, I think that's what really pushed me into the public space because I saw that, my friends were out there getting shot at. you know, and desperately trying to communicate with the world outside of Ukraine about what was happening and feeling hopelessly misunderstood and ignored, and that people think, well, this is some ridiculous, post-Soviet backwater. Why should we care? And they're probably all fascist anyways. And what, and so the moral imperative and just the solidarity imperative, because these are my friends, these are my colleagues, these are the people I work on projects with, I go to conferences with. Um,
Can you give us some color? Because this is a very general audience of people who might have, like, beyond the current Ukraine war and Russian invasion, might not have any sort of context in the history of Ukraine, especially going back to 2013, 2014, America's involvement in any way. So I'm going to ask you two quick questions, and I know this is probably going to be very hard for someone who, like, knows so much about the topics. First, I just want you to generally color your specialty and your scholarship around Eastern Europe, and perhaps, like, what insights does the world get from Eastern Europe that they might not get from anywhere else? Like, sort of like a why study the history of Eastern Europe. And I mean, I think between us, we know that there's so much catastrophe and so much politics and insights there, world wars, both of them, that have ties to what's happening in Eastern Europe. But I want you to just color, like, why Eastern Europe is one, and then two, just for the context, because you mentioned how important it is, color what happened in Ukraine 2013, 2014 that sort of pushed you to the public sphere.
yeah, those are great questions. Okay, so um, Eastern Eastern Europe, which is already a kind of controversial designation. What is Central? What is Eastern? But let's talk about the part of Europe that was under communist rule until more or less 1989, 1991.
Mhm.
Um, the Soviet Union comes into being as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. So we're looking at that period, 1917, 1922. Um, it collapses in 1991. Communism in Eastern Europe and the communist bloc that was non-Soviet falls in 1989. I was 17 in 1989. So the whole story of how I become an East Europeanist is incredibly generational, because I was the last generation to grow up during the Cold War. The world was divided into two blocks, the good West, and the evil empire, the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Reagan called it the evil empire. And there was an iron curtain between them. And you knew you were never going to be able to cross to the other side. And you knew that very bad things happened on the other side, but you didn't really know much about it because it wasn't the kind of place you could go back and forth. Um, and then the Berlin Wall falls in November 1989. And that was, for my parents' generation, everyone remembers where they were when they heard that JFK was shot. I remember where I was when I heard that the Berlin Wall fell. The Berlin Wall, which divided East Berlin from West Berlin, for decades, and people were shot to death just trying to escape from one side of that wall in the same city to the other side of the wall. The drama of that wall, and then one day it just comes down. And one day they're just like, okay, we'll just open it up. And that was that was an amazing, amazing moment, because this part of the world that had been closed, that had been dark, that had been shut behind lock and key, suddenly opened. So it was incredibly seductive. There was a sense of there was very much a kind of Wizard of Oz, Ding Dong, the Witch is dead.
Mhm, mhm.
Everybody was like, "Wow, now we're free. Let's go out in the streets and sing." And it was extraordinary. It was ecstatic. It was also an incredibly seductive time to be a historian because the archives were just opening.
Okay.
Would be the first person to get into certain archival collections as the Communist Party archives were being declassified. And the voyeuristic thrill of that, to be a was amazing. It was
Mhm,
like my whole cohort got so lucky in that sense. And it was also it was also a moment of where the dominant theory was Francis Fukuyama's The End of History.
mhm,
Essentially, that now all the bad guys have been defeated. Now we know that history is not moving inevitably, inexorably towards communism. Now we know that it's moving towards liberal democracy because really there's no other alternative. Eventually, we're all going to be good liberals. There was no real, thought at that time to disentangling democracy from liberalism, from free market neoliberalism,
Mhm.
that felt to be part of a kind of like some kind of harmonious utopian capitalist
Yeah.
package, that
Mhm.
all things go together. And that was the general motif. And it was very optimistic. I mean, it was also very condescending in a kind of triumphalist way. The sense was that the West was right. Now the backwards East is going to catch up. There was very much that going on. Um, but it was also it was messy. There was a lot of robber baron, wild capitalism going on in Eastern Europe. But there was a sense of, okay, there were bumps along the road, but basically everything was going to be okay, and we're
Mhm.
moving towards happily ever after. And all the dark secrets are coming out of the archives, which is just incredibly thrilling to be a historian going into those archives. Um, so that was, I guess that was the first part of the question. So that was Eastern Europe. As Eastern Europe was transitioning from communism to capitalism, which nobody knew how to do because it had never been done before,
Yeah.
really. And so there was a whole school of transitology. How do you do that?
Mhm.
How do you do it economically? How do you take a place where property is state owned and return it to private ownership? So there was that whole school of thought. But also the how do you create democratic culture?
Mhm.
I remember being at a research institute as an intern in Prague, and the director saying, "Okay, Thursday morning, breakfast meeting, creation of democratic culture in Eastern Europe." Thursday over bagels, we were gonna resolve the whole problem. Like,
Wow. It sounds riveting. It sounds fun. Fun challenge.
there was I mean, there's also this sense of all these Westerners came into Eastern Europe and, like, "We're gonna show you how to do it."
Mhm.
And the scene that I kept being haunted by, which some of your listeners might remember, was the last chapter of The Handmaid's Tale. Um, so The Handmaid's Tale is this, as many of you probably know, this dystopian, feminist dystopian novel, by Margaret Atwood, and based on the diary of one of the victims of this totalitarian dystopian regime, the handmaid that was found. And the last chapter of the novel suddenly jumps in time. And I forget exactly how long, 100 years later, 200 years later. And you're at an academic conference of historians who have discovered this diary that had been the basis of the story we have all just read. And they're sitting around the table very calmly discussing how we're going to use this source, and they want to be very professional and very objective. And of course, there were things that were quite gruesome and oppressive in this story, but they don't want to be overly judgmental because we all know that these kinds of judgmental values are, culture specific and temporally specific.
Mm.
You look at those historians and there's something very chilling about their cold distance that they have. But they're being perfectly respectable from a professional sense. But because you've just read this story, you feel like their professional distance, there's something eerie about that
Yeah.
distance. And my whole becoming a historian in the 1990s, I felt like I was in the last chapter of The Handmaid's Tale. I'm sitting in these archives reading these descriptions of this totalitarian hell of times past. And
Mhm.
the debate historians are having are, how can we be objective? How do we tell the story in such a way that we're not biased? Well, of course, the standards then were different from what they are now, and the values are different. And how do we not project our own value? And all of the questions about moral relativism that historians are always asking. And I had this like, what does it mean to be in that last chapter? Um, and now, you know, 30 years later, 25 years later, I have this even worse feeling that we're not in the last chapter anymore. Suddenly we've been tossed back into the middle of the novel.
Mhm.
How did that happen? Like, that was
Yeah.
I mean, there was this moment that you might remember from the very end of Kamala Harris's campaign,
Mhm.
after Michelle Obama gave that remarkable speech that involved a kind of deep dive into the cost that women pay
Mhm.
on reproductive health care. Um, and she says in that speech, she addresses men and says, "Don't let us be the collateral damage of your rage." And
Mhm.
women and says, "Remember, your vote is secret." You know,
Yeah. I remember that campaign. Mhm.
and then it was just the last days of the campaign, and I think the Lincoln Project and maybe some other lobby group came out with these secret voter ads
Mhm.
for, women going to the polling places with their husband who expect the husbands who were Trump supporters who expected the women to vote with them, and then the women exchanging those furtive glances at one they're in the polling place and secretly voting for Kamala Harris. And I found that absolutely chilling. I mean, I found that terrifying because the subtext was violence, right? Like the subtext was that these were women who were afraid of their partners.
Mhm.
These were women who were not going to have this conversation with their partners. Like, and that violence lurking beneath the like, oh yes, honey, of course, like everything is great. Yes, of course I voted. Um, I felt like that was a scene right out of The Underground in The Handmaid's Tale. Looking at those women in the polling places exchanging those glances, I thought, oh my God, we're back in the middle of that novel. I watched it with my 12-year-old daughter, and this was actually one of my proudest parenting moments because she said to me, she said, Mommy, the first problem is that those women should not have been married to those men in the first place, right? Like, we're so proud. I was "Yeah, you're right. That's the first problem. You should never be in a relationship with someone you're afraid of, ever, like ever,
Yeah,
never.
especially for such, like, a benign thing as, like, who you vote for, like, that's
Yeah.
I mean, like, there's no circumstance where that's okay, but, like, you're voting, your political decisions can I guess the implication would lead to, like, intimate partner violence in one way or another.
Like, that violence was so palpable, and so I mean, it's been one of the things that's been terrifying me, going back to your question about, like, why I wanted to leave, I mean,
Yeah.
that I part of it was that the monk school was a very exciting place for me. Part of it was that, I thought, like, "Okay, I've loved teaching at Yale, but I've been there for 20 years." I never thought I'd spend my whole career at one institution. Nice to career change, and part of it was I could feel the violence in the air, and I wanted to get my kids out for their teenage years.
Yeah, okay, so all that's very, 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 very helpful. I appreciate you deep diving on all those reasons why, you left, how it was a long-term decision, so forgive any drama that was created around it. I mean, I saw some of the other articles, also probably, I think, framed it as directly reaction to Trump, but it's helpful to know that you saw it coming. I guess it's almost like Sarah Palin was like an underrated player in a lot of these conversations around what sort of was the precursor to this moment that we're seeing right now. I want to go back even further in time, specifically in history. One thing that the audience members of my work love is a good reading recommendation or a thinker recommendation or really anything related to recommendation where people can offline themselves, get a book from wherever it is, read it, or at least skim it, or ideally get through the whole thing. But I know how some people are they get the book and they don't necessarily find the time to get through everything. But my hope is that people who are watching this, people who are young, are at least able to buy a book, get an audio book, do something to educate themselves beyond just social media. So to ask you, to point this towards you, can you give us a few reading recommendations for either thinkers in the past or memoirs or biographers or whoever that help you make sense of today's situation. And these can all be from the syllabus of European intellectual history. They could be from your own personal reading recommendations in your own personal library. But maybe if we could think of 3 to 4, that would be, and you can just say what they are, maybe explain what it is, and then what aspect of today it helps you make sense of.
Okay, I'll try to give you a mix of genres. The first thing I would say, and this is very, very cool, um, is an extraordinary memoir by one of the great women of the 20th century who is too little known, named Heda Margolius Kovály. And the memoir in English is Under a Cruel Star. The title in English is Under a Cruel Star. And she was a Czech Jew who was a Holocaust survivor, um, who then her husband also miraculously survives the Holocaust. The rest of their families were killed. She escapes from a death march. She goes back to Prague. None of her friends will take her in because it's too dangerous under Nazi occupation. After the war, she and her husband join the Communist Party, and he, whose name is Rudolf Margolis, is one of the 14 defendants in the infamous Stalinist show trial, the Slansky trial.
Mm.
Um, she was described in one of Yusuf Skoretsky's roman Klefts as the woman who has been to hell twice and is still very much alive. Um, she's an incredibly human, perceptive observer, of what happens to people under totalitarian conditions, and she gets at you get both Nazism and Stalinism in their full intensity and the intersection between them. And you don't need any specialized knowledge, you don't need any philosophical vocabulary. It's a very, very human story. It's one of the heartbreaking stories of the 20th century, but she's really absolutely remarkable. So yeah, I would first say Under a Cruel Star, Heda Margolius Kovály. Um, Everyone should read Hannah Arendt, as you know. She's like my great love. Uh,
Which work specifically, the totalitarianism one?
I would say Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Okay,
Um,
I'm writing that. Feel free to give an overview of what both are about.
Totalitarianism was the original, in some ways, the classic attempt in terms of philosophically, sociologically, politically to understand Nazism and Stalinism and what was similar between them from a historical point of view and really from an existential point of view. It's a long book divided into three sections. It goes through anti Semitism, imperialism, and then totalitarianism. It remains the classic work. Um, it's not an easy she's a very good writer, unlike, some of these philosophers, but it's still not an easy read. It's very dense. Um, the and there's a whole series of various subtle arguments that run through anti-Semitism, through imperialism in the third world, into 20th century totalitarian movements. And then there's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is a shorter book and easier to read, which she writes some 10 years later, 12 years later. Um, and that and that's also a remarkable book. That's a book, and that was extremely controversial book, that gets her death threats and hated by many people around the world. It's still a book I go back to constantly to teach. So Adolf Eichmann was the who would you call him? The German civil servant in the Nazi regime who was responsible for, let's call it, the organization of the so-called final solution. So right. So Hitler wants to kill all the Jews. Well, how do you kill millions of people? Well, you've got to organize camps and you've got to organize trains. You have to organize transportation. You have to coordinate guards. Like there's a lot of organizational details. So he's the organization guy. And he escapes to Argentina. So when other leading Nazi figures are put on trial at Nuremberg after the war, he's escaped to Argentina. He's living under a different name. The Israeli Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, looks for this guy for years. They're determined to get this guy, and finally they do. He's illegally kidnapped by the Mossad in Argentina when they find him, flown to Israel to be put on trial. So it's a kind of extraordinary show trial, right? Because, Israel has invested a lot. It's not a legal extradition. They don't ask Argentina to turn him over. They go and get him,
Hmm.
put him on trial. And what the trial then is used for also is to educate a new generation and first generation Israelis about what happened in the Holocaust.
Can you give quick context? What year are they capturing him? Like how long after the Holocaust is this?
Trial was 61. They
Okay.
either 60 or 61, but the trial is.
Okay.
So Hannah Arendt publishes Origins of Totalitarianism. The war ends in 45. She publishes Origins of Totalitarianism in 51. So this is 10 years later. She has come, she escaped from Nazi Germany as a Jew in 33. She went first to France and then to the United States. So she's been living, by the time the Adolf Eichmann trial comes, she's been living in the States and teaching in the States and writing in English for more than 15 years. And the New Yorker sends her to Jerusalem to cover the trial. And one of the interesting things about that, I say this as someone who's very interested in languages, is that she's a native German speaker and Eichmann is speaking German, and they have translators there. But it was important at the trial that the three Israeli judges were also native German speakers. They wanted them to understand directly. And Arendt is listening to him in her native language. And the book is very inflected by then because the language really penetrates her. What
Mm.
strikes her when she gets there and she's watching him is the extraordinary disparity between the monstrosity of the deed and the mediocrity of the person.
Mm.
What strikes her is how not only does he not seem particularly evil or sadistic or hateful, and he just seems utterly banal, mediocre, a kind of pathetically ordinary bureaucrat who was interested in career advancement. They told him to organize, trains deporting Jews to gas chambers. He tried to do that with great energy and enthusiasm so he'd get a promotion. If they had had him organizing, something else, he would have done the same thing, interested in career upward mobility as opposed to actual like content. He didn't have anything against Jews. I mean, in particular, I mean, he like was kind of, all the same to him. His defense was, well, loyal subjects of good governments are lucky. Loyal subjects of bad governments are unlucky. I was a loyal subject of a bad government. I happened to get unlucky. And this terrifies her because she's listening to him and she's like, every sentence out of his mouth is a cliche. His German is the most sort of trite, cliched German, as if none of the words were fresh. And she says his failure to speak is part of a failure to think. And for Arendt, his greatest crime was his failure to think. You get this order and you just carry it out. You do this and you carry it out. And she tells this story that she calls, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil.
Mhm.
And the book is widely read as an attempt to exculpate Eichmann and say, well, see, he wasn't so bad. We should be generous. And I think this is a profound misunderstanding. I think for Arendt, his failure to think doesn't make him better than other criminals, but makes him worse. For her, the greatest crime is a failure to think. There is never an excuse for failing to think. You're always already obligated to think for yourself. And I think that's for her, and it comes from a certain kind of philosophical education where the moral imperative is to think. And to think for her, denken in German is a very big word, but it's very controversial.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, from what I generally know, also within Jewish culture, at least Ashkenazi Jewish culture, like the debate and the inquiry and like the desire to challenge and always like critique things is that a large part of the culture? I feel like I've heard that somewhere. I don't want to like misreport, but
It is. I mean, it definitely, you can read that back in traditional Talmudic study, which is a lot about debate and interpretation, right, you can definitely read a lot of continuity through that. She's not especially generous to Jews in that book either. I mean, she writes
okay.
Judenrat, which were the Jewish community leadership that was often co-opted by the Nazis,
Mm,
um, and asked to organize their own communities. And that then becomes a moral dilemma because the Nazis were then using traditional community structures as collaborators. And those traditional community structures were thinking, if we cooperate, we'll get a better deal. If we cooperate, we'll manage to save some people, not realizing that in the end, this was a hopeless situation. You know,
mhm,
she's very harsh on them. She's that that's whole strategy of accommodation and hoping to make a deal with the powers that be, that Jews as a disempowered minority who were never in power themselves had used over centuries, turned out to really, really be the wrong strategy. And she's
mhm.
harsh on them in this book. Um, but the basic insight that everyone wanted to see Satan in Eichmann because
Yeah.
are emotionally satisfying to see the demonization of the bad guy is much more emotionally satisfying. And there was something that I think people found humiliating about, like, well, the demons were actually these ordinary people. Uh, but from a historian's point of view, it's a profoundly important insight. Um, later you have the book Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. I mean, the fact that my instinct as a historian too is that your sadistic lunatic demographic is always going to be marginal.
Mhm,
There are always going to be some people in any population who, for whatever reason, just have, sadistic inclinations, no moral compass. Regardless of the conditions, they're going to behave badly. I think you've also, on the other end, got a handful of people with uncanny moral clarity and heroism, who, regardless of the conditions, will always hold up. But most people, most of the time, do not fall into either one of those categories. Most people, most of the time, their behavior is shaped by the social situation in which they find themselves. And this has been the overwhelming result of all of the social science that's been done since the Holocaust and the Second World War. And so the fact that like you don't need a whole population of people who are just lusting after the blood of Jews in order to create a Holocaust. A lot of that is people like Eichmann who are just not thinking for themselves and are doing the thing that seems, advantageous at the moment, which in ordinary circumstances would not necessarily be evil. And the bureaucrats trying to, be enthusiastic and do a good job at their job so they get a promotion. That's not evil, you know, as such. That's like, that's, bureaucracy everywhere. That's, upward mobility everywhere. So at what point then do you have these authoritarian regimes that are mobilizing these ordinary people who are not particularly sadistic, you know,
Mhm.
into the creation of evil and into the doing of evil? And I think that's such a central lesson. The fact that people will go along with these things, that they will talk themselves into things, that being in a position of authority, people will go along with people who are in authority, be they Putin or Trump, or like there's a tendency to think, oh, well, that's the authority. Therefore, I'm just doing the thing you're supposed to do. Um, my son, who is on the spectrum, lightly on the spectrum, and has never had an inclination to go along with authority. That's his thing.
It's a good thing.
That's and a lot of the time, throughout, like, it's gotten much better now, but when he was, like, small, like, he never saw why should he have to eat with a fork? Why can't he eat with his fingers? Like, what is the moral advantage of eating with a fork? It's much more annoying, and, like, why should you do it with a f why just because everyone else does it, do I have to do it? And at one point before the 2020 elections, we were talking about fascism, and I told him about the Milgram study. Which is, if your listeners do not know the Milgram study, everyone should go out and read Milgram.
Right.
Um this is also really central. In fact, this was the Milgram study was known as the study, and it comes directly out of Eichmann in Jerusalem. Uh, Stanley Milgram was actually a Yale social scientist who was looking at the Eichmann trial and trying to understand the phenomenon of obedience to authority. And he ran these studies at Yale. And he was soliciting, like all of these social psych studies. You've all probably seen the advertisements. Do you want to earn $10 by participating in?
Mhm.
Was that kind of thing. You get random volunteers, pay them some small amount of money, say it's only going to take an hour of your time. I did this in college all the time. I volunteered for these studies to make a little bit of money here and there. So he says it's a study, and the claim was it's a study about the effects of punishment on learning and memorization. And so the volunteers were told that they were going to draw straws to decide who was going to be the learner and who was going to be the teacher. Um, and the learner gives the teacher, if I remember the details correctly, there were certain set pairs of words that you had to remember, and then how quickly could you memorize them. And then every time you made a mistake, the teacher was supposed to administer an electric shock
Mhm.
in increasing voltages, until the point where the learner was ostensibly, passed out or dead. Now, in reality, nobody was getting any shock. And in reality, of course, there was a setup. All of the volunteers were exclusively teachers. The people playing the learners were Confederates of the experimenters, so people working for the lab who were pretending to be shocked.
Yeah.
Uh,
And if I remember correctly, like the what the, teacher would hear or, like, know about the learners that, like, they would hear yelling, they would hear the pain, they would get the reaction from the individual. So I don't know if they would, like, be able to see them per se, but they would know that the pain is happening.
I think it's at least some of the studies they could see them, but I back and recheck. But they certainly
Yeah.
knew that they were causing pain to people, or
Mhm.
they were. In reality, they weren't. The experimenters were not that perverse. Nobody was actually exposed to any,
Yeah.
but the teachers believed that they were. And the question was, how many people would actually administer these shocks? Not under any coercion. There's no one holding a gun to their head. Like, worst thing that would happen are you leave and you don't get your $5. And what happens is that the vast majority of volunteers continue to administer shocks all the way to the point where they seem to be deadly. So you've eliminated the variable of having any personal hostility towards the person you're hurting. You've eliminated that completely. You've eliminated the variable of thinking that you could never be in their position because they were told it was completely random to see who was assigned to what side. And you've eliminated the variable of there being any threat of violence because you're in a university laboratory. When the volunteer would express discomfort, the scientists would just say, "Oh, please continue. The experiment, requires that you continue." But there was no actual coercive mechanism. And and Milgram himself was shocked at the result.
I
They
imagine.
but it turns out that most people with no hostility, no animus, you've removed all sorts of racist and you've removed all sorts of subjective variables. Most people go along with authority. My son, when I told him this story about the Milgram study, he said, "Mommy, I would be one of those people who wouldn't even give the first shock, wouldn't I? Because I never want to do things just because other people tell me to." And I said, "Yes, that is totally true." And like 99% of the time, I'm banging my head against the wall because, at school, you have to eat with a fork, and at a restaurant, you have to eat with a fork. But sometimes it's exactly the thing that gives you the moral clarity. And that's what you don't want to train out of the kids
Mhm.
while you're teaching them to eat with a fork, because there are all sorts of reasons why we conform to get along with society. There are all sorts of reasons why we don't get to make up our own rules, and there are rules. But there are also moments where going along with the thing that authority is telling us to do, is the moral abyss.
Yeah. I'm just gonna stop you because I know we blocked. Actually, I think we've blocked off a little bit more time. Do you have just about maybe 10 more minutes? I'm thinking about wrapping up with one question that I have for you, and then I can also tell the audience members based on anything you guys have heard throughout this entire discussion. Like, feel free to drop some questions. Maybe we can rapid fire through some of them. The question that I have for you, in light of what you just told me, and of course what you study generally, the two hells as one of the I think stories that you one of the memoirs put it, um, in being the Nazism and Stalinism that both occurred in Eastern Europe, as well as once again everything else that's occurred since with the invasions and the war on truth that's happening. How do you manage, like, the emotional toll of reading these stories and perhaps the frustration of knowing that, okay, like, if I had a time machine and went back to this one thing, like, probably could have changed, on one end, like, the frustration of people's bad decisions, on the other end, the weight of the tragedy, the weight of, like, the deaths and the tortures and the broken families and all of that, like, how do you manage the emotions related to that? And I ask as someone who studies a lot of what I make videos about and what I study relates to slavery, the chattel slavery, as well as Native American genocide. So, yeah, like how do you stay sane studying these topics?
Oh, my kids would say I don't really stay safe. I'm constantly tearing my hair out. I do a lot of jogging and a lot of yoga, but sane would be a high bar. I'm not safe. Don't have the distance on it that a lot of people have on it. If I didn't get a chance to tell you the story about the Ukrainian Revolution, but I did write a book about it, which is totally accessible. It's a short book called The Ukrainian Night, and it's really a book. It's a book that tells the story of the Ukrainian Revolution through the lens of really my friends and colleagues and the friends and colleagues of my friends and colleagues who took part in that revolution. And you can feel, even though as I'm telling other people's stories, you can feel that I'm not a neutral observer.
Mm,
No. And I mean, now when I go around and I talk to a lot of different audiences about Ukraine. And the first thing I always put on the table is that, I'm not Ukrainian. Um, but these are my friends and colleagues. I'm not a neutral who are being killed, and I'm not a neutral observer. In some ways, the world is always divided into people you know personally and people you don't know personally. And that cuts across all sorts of racial, ethnic, religious, class divides.
mhm,
No person, it's very hard to have any distance, and I tend to write without that much distance, and I try just to kind of put that up front. Um, like one of the books I've been teaching, this is another book everybody should read. The English is called The Torture Camp on Paradise Street. by a writer, actually probably close to your generation, Stanislav Asayev, uh,
Hmm.
uh, was a philosophy student from Donetsk in the Donbass, who read like his you'll if you've taken my class, which is on YouTube, so everyone can listen to the lectures now.
Yeah, everyone, you can all take the classes I took, European intellectual history. All you do is Google it and write Yale, and you'll find it.
Yeah, all the lectures are there, they're all freely accessible. Stanislav has a lot of those same references. I didn't know him at the time, but he was a philosophy student in Donetsk. After the war, the Russian-sponsored war begins in the far eastern Ukraine, not in 2022, but 2014. And at that point, a lot of his friends flee, but he doesn't. He stays. He stays and he starts writing kind of weekly reports, essays under a pseudonym for Radio Liberty. He's caught at a certain point by the separatists who have taken over where he lives, and imprisoned in a torture facility for 2.5 years, and really like gruesomely tortured regularly over like with other political prisoners over the course of 2.5 years. Um, and he eventually is released in a prisoner exchange in 2019. He's undergoing rehabilitation in Prague, and he writes this book. He writes this book about his experiences, and it's inflected by a lot of French existentialism. It's inflected by Viktor Frankl. Like, what did all this mean? Where did cruelty come from? But it's also this very basic, very human story of what it was like, inside this place. And it reads like it's a classic of what we would call Gulag literature or Auschwitz literature or prison literature. It's in that genre. But what's chilling about it is that unlike all of these other books that I read, it was like 2 weeks ago. Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
very, um, and he's of your generation. I mean, he must be. When they caught him in 2017, he must have been around 26. He's in his early 30s now. Um, I
Yeah.
forget where I was going with that.
No, I mean, the question was, it seems like there's not a strong way to just like stay sane, and that's not necessarily a goal, or it might not necessarily be a goal that we should aspire to try to kind of like stay okay, because when we're not okay, we can ideally take the proper action, at least raise more awareness. When you mentioned the idea of like the prison literature, the literature to come out of people who have been trapped in these horrible situations in these almost infamous places during different time periods, it's like, well, what infamous place right now are we going to get that literature about? Whether it's like Uyghur camps in China or the people out in Sikot in El Salvador. Everyone, I mean, I hear reports over and over about human rights abuses, and you constantly see images, but like you don't really know what's going on until, like you said, the archives are opened up. The people who are a part of that or are taken there are either liberated or released, and they can tell their own stories. But it's so scary to think that, as you mentioned, not only can it happen like a few years ago with this book, but it could be happening right now.
and I don't make that much of an attempt to neutralize my voice.
Mm,
There are other writers and academics who have a much more professional distance, or at least try to maintain a much more professional.
mhm.
Um, the voice I write in, we all have to write in our own voice to some extent,
Yes.
and so for better or for worse, I might tell you another anecdote. When I went to pick up my son after orientation, his first day of ninth grade, his geography teacher, came out, who I didn't really know. I mean, we just got into this school, and she hugged me and said, "Yeah, I've been listening to your lectures on YouTube." And my daughter said, "Yeah, mom, anyone who listens to your lectures knows that you need a hug."
That's funny. That's very funny.
I don't stay sane in the sense of, staying very calm. Like I do feel like it's hard for me to teach Stasha's book because I know him, or I first read the book, but now I've gotten to know him. Like, he's a real person to me. Uh,
Mhm,
Cat pictures to my daughter. Like, um the fact that he was, regularly tied to a board and tortured with electric shocks. Like, I can't talk about that, as if like there's a neutral distance involved.
mhm. Hmm. Well, on that note, on tortured and electric shocks, I do want to thank you so much for taking your time to have this discussion. For anyone who's watching right now, the way that it works is I'll post a live out on Substack. I'll make a transcript with like a bit of an outline, not a transcript of everything we're saying, but like an outline with timestamps based on the different topics that we've talked about. And then I'll also try to pull out short form clips because whether you realize it or not, Professor Shore, like a lot of the things you were saying fit perfectly into like bite-sized chunks that are just super powerful. And I think that will reach even a wider audience when it's put on other platforms. So thank you all for joining. Please make sure you get Professor Shore's book, Ukrainian Night. And I believe you can get that at the Yale University Press, Amazon, as well as bookshop.org if you want to support your local bookstores. And thanks for being a subscriber. There was one question that I did see that I think was actually the perfect way to end before we say like or before you give your final goodbye. And that was just how do we get people or how do we urge people to open up their mind and start thinking for themselves?
Yeah, no, this is that there's no substitute for people who can think. Like that's I mean, this is the Arendtian legacy. Like there's education is the front line. I feel like we should all of us should be focusing on education and really like education from, preschool all the way through. I mean, when I get students at the university level, that's a very luxurious time to get them. You're basically already formed and then you're just kind of polishing a certain things. But like the real frontline moment, the real frontline moment comes earlier. The other thing I'd say is that totalitarian regimes, tyranny feeds on atomization. It feeds on, that the famous, quotation about the Holocaust. First, they came for the socialist, and I didn't.
Mhm,
I was socialist, right? Like it feeds on a kind of arbitrariness of terror. Well, first they're taking this person away, then they're taking that person away, and well, this person wrote an op-ed that was critical of Israel, and suddenly they disappear from the streets. And because nobody knows who's going to be next, everybody kinds of retreats. You know,
mhm,
it creates this atmosphere of terror. You don't want to be next. You want to kind of lower your head and keep your head down. And that atomization is what these regimes feed on. And the only then hope for an antidote is real solidarity. And it's very hard to get that. You need a lot of people because individuals acting rationally always have a reason to take care of themselves first and make compromises with tyranny because
mhm,
it's scary. And I say this as someone who I'm not a particularly brave person. It's one of the reasons if my husband had been alone, he would have gone back to the States to fight. I mean,
mhm,
very strongly about that. I did not trust myself to be physically courageous. I thought, what would I do if I'm sitting with one of my foreign students and they try to take that person away, guys in balaclavas? Would I try to fight with them? Would I try to pull the mask off? Would I try to I don't trust, I mean, the fact that I don't know terrifies me. I don't trust myself to be brave. Because there's a collective action problem that everyone rationally, anytime you refuse to compromise, you're taking a big risk for yourself, and it's unclear if your little action is going to actually make any difference. Whereas the risk for yourself is very big and very real. And the only antidote to that, and it happens rarely but occasionally in history, including in Ukraine in 2014, which was the miracle of that revolution, is solidarity. You need you need a critical mass of people crossing to the other side of fear all at the same time and standing up for one another. You need everybody saying, like, it's not just a question of the people who are Black or women or Southeast Asian who are being purged by DEI. It's all of us. You
mhm,
need everyone saying that if they purge authentic history from elementary schools, that is all of us. We are crippling all of us by a failure to look at the truth. You need you need everyone getting together and saying we're going to look out for one another. That's very, very hard to do. It happens rarely. When it does happen in history, it's usually just for a kind of flicker of a second. But it's that the fact that it can ever happen at all, and this was the miracle of the Ukrainian Revolution, for me was proof that it means that we human beings are capable of it. And if we're capable of it, it means that we can keep trying for it.
I know you can't see it, but everyone who's watching on Substack, wherever they are, they're clapping for you right now. That was beautifully put. I cannot ask for a better ending to this conversation. So once again, I'm just gonna say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for taking your time out, Professor Shore, and sharing all your wisdom and insights and knowledge with all of us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was lovely to see you again.
Great to see you as well. Bye, everyone.